Welcome back to the Weekly Education Pulse. I'm Sammy.
I'm Tony. Each week we bring to you the global snapshot of the most important developments shaping international school sector.
Yeah, this week we're covering 5 stories that highlight how international education continues to expand, evolve, and come under increasing regulatory and market pressure across different regions.
We look at a UK school expanding into Thailand, rising global demand for British international schools, a rapidly growing international school in Portugal, and new regulatory challenge facing international schools in Ethiopia.
So let's dive in. And our first story this week comes from India, where the K. Rahija Corp has announced plans to introduce the first international school in Juanagadh, Navi Mumbai, as part of a wider 50-acre mixed-use development.
The school will form part of a large integrated district combining residential, commercial and social infrastructure. Education is being positioned as a central anchor rather than a secondary add-on within the development.
Yeah, what's significant here is how international schooling is increasingly tied to urban planning and real estate strategy. Developers are recognizing that high-quality education provision can directly influence demand, pricing, and long-term viability of large mixed-use projects.
And for families in Navi Mumbai, this represents new access to international education closer to home, without needing to commute, or to more established international school hubs elsewhere in the city.
Yeah, this is reflecting a broader trend we're seeing across India. International schools are no longer confined to expatriate enclaves or central business districts. They are increasingly embedded in new residential and commercial corridors designed for India's growing middle and upper middle classes.
And for international school operators, partnerships with major developers can offer scale, infrastructure, and long-term demand alignment in one of the world's fastest growing education markets. Our second story this week comes from Indonesia, where International School of Jakarta has announced the creation of a British boarding school pathway for its first cohort of senior pupils.
Yeah, the initiative is designed to support students and families considering transition into UK boarding schools, providing structured guidance, academic preparation, and clear progression routes from an international day school context.
Stands out here is the intentionality of the pathway. Rather than leaving families to navigate the transition independently, the school is formalising support around curriculum alignment, pastoral readiness, and admissions processes.
Yeah, this reflects a wider shift we're seeing across international schools. Schools are increasingly positioning themselves not just end destinations, but as feeder institutions into global education pathways, particularly UK boarding and also for higher education institutions.
Families, this reduces uncertainty and risk around major transitions. For schools, it strengthens value proposition by demonstrating long-term outcomes and global connectivity.
And more broadly, underlines the continued pull of British boarding education in Asia, even as local international school provision continues to expand and diversify. And our third story this week comes from Portugal, where Bright International School, based in the Algarve, is continuing a period of rapid and highly controlled growth as it expands its international education offer.
Since joining the sharing education group, Bright has grown quickly but deliberately, positioning itself as a full-through international school for students aged 3 to 16, with the IGCSE programme now in place and A-levels scheduled to launch from 2027.
Yeah, what stands out here is the school's approach to growth. Class sizes are capped at 18 students, and expansion is being driven by a clear educational philosophy focused on high standards, personal development, and long-term outcomes rather than scale for its own sake.
The introduction of the IGCSE programme in 25-26 academic year has been a key milestone for them. According to the school, the first cohort has already exceeded expectations, reinforcing demand from families seeking academically rigorous but balanced international education in the region.
Yeah, Bright is also placing strong emphasis on experiential learning. One of the more distinctive initiatives highlighted is the launch of a student-run electric vehicle race team, which integrates engineering, business, marketing, and leadership into a real-world learning experience.
Alongside curriculum development, the school has invested significantly in the facilities, including new learning spaces and expanded sports infrastructure. This reflects a broader trend in Portugal where international schools are competing on depth of offer, not just a curriculum label.
And more broadly, Bright's trajectory illustrates how Portugal's international schools market is maturing. Schools are increasingly expected to deliver academic rigor, well-being, experiential learning, and strong community identity all at once.
For families relocating to the Algarve or already based in the region, this kind of controlled, values-led growth is becoming a key differentiator. And for the wider sector, it shows how international schools in Portugal are moving beyond niche provision into more established competitive education ecosystems. And our fourth story this week comes from Ethiopia, where international schools are facing potential downgrades unless they meet a requirement that at least 30% of their students are foreign nationals.
Yeah, according to the report, schools that fail to meet this threshold risk being reclassified, which could significantly affect how they operate, how they are regulated, and how they are perceived by families.
What's important here is the intent behind the policy. Regulators are seeking to draw a clearer distinction between international schools and private national schools, particularly as demand from local families for international education continues to grow.
But this is creating a real tension, because in many markets, international schools are increasingly serving local and returnee families, not just expatriates. So a rigid foreign student quota doesn't always reflect the realities of demand.
Schools this introduces a strategic risk. Enrollment mix becomes not just a market outcome, but a compliance issue. Schools may be forced to reconsider admission strategy, fee structures, or even curriculum positioning to maintain international status.
Yeah, this raises a familiar question across emerging markets: how governments regulate international schools as they become more embedded into local education ecosystems.
And while this policy is specific to Ethiopia, it does reflect a wider global challenge. As international education expands beyond expatriate communities, regulatory frameworks are being tested and in some cases rewritten.
And our final story this week comes from Singapore, where EIS International Preschool is being highlighted for its inquiry-based approach to early years education.
The school's model places strong emphasis on child-led inquiry, exploration and play-based learning, aligning closely with international best practice in early childhood education rather than traditional content-heavy instruction.
Yeah, what's notable here is how early years provision continues to evolve in highly competitive international education markets like Singapore. Parents are increasingly informed and discerning, particularly when it comes to how children learn in their foundational years.
Inquiry-based models are attractive because they focus on developing curiosity, communication, collaboration, and problem-solving skills from a young age rather than early academic acceleration alone.
Yeah, and we're seeing a broader shift here where early years education is no longer viewed simply as preparation for primary school, but as a critical stage in its own right, shaping long-term learning behaviors and well-being.
For international schools, strong early years provision is increasingly a differentiator. Schools that can clearly articulate their philosophy and demonstrate impact at this stage are better positioned to build long-term trust with families. And that brings us to the end of this week's Weekly Education Pulse.
Yeah, from school expansion and rising demand to regulation and market maturity, these stories show how international education is becoming more complex, competitive, and closely scrutinized.
As always, thank you for listening and engaging with the Weekly Education Pulse. If there's a story or trend in your region that you think we should be following, do let us know.
And we'll be back next week with more updates from the international schools market. So until then, see you next time.